Welcome to our listeners to the second of our podcast in regard to a new book by author Sean Meek called In the Shadow of the Ark, which focuses on the Genesis flood. And today we will discuss, why does Genesis matter? Sean, what did Jesus think about Genesis?
Jesus quoted from Genesis more than any other book in the Bible, especially the first 11 chapters, which are the most, what people call controversial, which really means mocked, chapters of the Bible, the first 11 chapters, because they say a lot of things that people today say, oh, that couldn't possibly have happened. There couldn't possibly have been a worldwide flood, even while they're looking at layers of sedimentary rock with fossils in them, which could only be laid down by mud. I mean, every fossil that's out there, every single one was buried in mud. It might have been limestone mud, it might have been sandstone mud, but it was mud of some sort. Well, where does lots of mud come from? That is lots of water. And that's what happened. The layers of rock out there don't represent long times, they represent rapid burial. That's what the flood did. And so although this book is not specifically about the action of the flood in creating fossils, it's about the world before the flood. We can see stories about the flood all over the world. There are over 200 flood stories around the world. One of the most famous one is probably the Atlantis story. A lot of people don't think of Atlantis story as being a flood story, but it is. It talks about Atlantis being a land of great people who did amazing, wonderful things, could do all sorts of great stuff, but got so evil that they were punished by what? By a flood. And they were flooded out, they were buried in this great flood. It's basically the Genesis story told from a different perspective, and it's actually an Egyptian story. A lot of people think of Genesis as Atlantis as being a Greek story, but it wasn't. It was a man named Solon who went to Egypt in around 500 BC, heard the story in Egypt, took it back to Greece, told the story, and people there liked it so much, they kept copying, especially a man named Plato. But think about this about Egypt. Egypt was one of the first civilizations to start up after the Tower of Babel situation, when the people were scattered by the change of languages. There are two civilizations that came almost immediately after Babel. One was Egypt, and the other was in Sumeria. Sumeria also has a flood story called the Gilgamesh Epic, which tells the same story about a man who built a great ark, a great box, put creatures in it, and then the flood came, washed everything away except for him and the creatures in the ark. It tells the same story. Now, a lot of people will say, well, Gilgamesh Epic was published before the Genesis story. Well, it may have been published before the Genesis story, but it wasn't told before the Genesis story. The Genesis story was kept as records for thousands of years, actually, from the time of Adam until the time of Jacob, when it ends with the people going into Egypt, the Israelites going to Egypt. And there are actually 10 books in the book of Genesis and at least 12 authors. What I love about the Bible is if you look carefully at each book, whether it's Genesis or any of the other ones, every story is either told by an eyewitness or someone who's talked to an eyewitness.
Right, sure.
For instance, Luke did not see the birth, but he talked to people who did, the birth of Jesus. But he talked to people who did. He kept a record of their telling first-hand stories. Genesis is the first-hand story of what happened. The first part of Genesis is God telling Adam what to write. Second part of Genesis is Adam told what he saw. Then the next part of Genesis is Noah telling his part of the story. Then the next part of the story is Ham, Shem, and Japheth telling their part of the story. And it goes on like that, covering a period of several thousand years, but each person who is in it tells their story. Eyewitness account.
Right.
And although the book In the Shadow of the Ark is not exactly an eyewitness account, it does say things about what had to have been true at the time the story was told. Now, Kenan, who's the protagonist of the story, tells it from his perspective, which I did because I wanted to be outside of Noah's family so they could look into it and see it from an outside perspective. And he does it. Because one of the things we have to know about Noah is this. Noah was a very rich man. He had to have been rich, because he spent about 100 years building this ark.
Right.
And whether he hired people, which he almost had to have done.
Right.
But he also had to buy stuff. I mean, think about it. Not only did he have to have massive amounts of wood prepared, could one man have prepared enough wood to have actually built the ark? No. And then say, well, what about his sons? Well, his sons were only born about 100 years before the flood came, which means they would have only been young men able to really help for about 80 years. So you had Noah, who had a 120-year head start. Mm-hmm. His sons had 80 years before the flood came, but could 4 people have actually built that in that period of time? Even if they could have done it, Noah still had to have been rich because they had to eat while they were building the ark. And if they're building the ark, they had no time to farm or to take care of animals or livestock, nothing. So, and again, Noah had to have bought things from other people. He had to have bought the wood, the metal, the pitch. How long do you think it takes to get barrels and barrels, hundreds of barrels of pitch that it would have taken to seal the ark from the inside and out?
And I love how you bring in the logic into the book of Genesis like that, because those are things I don't think we usually think of. We just read the Bible account and keep going, but that's the really meat, even inside, maybe even between the lines.
They're logical and had to have been true.
Right.
Noah was not only rich, but he also had to have been very specially protected. Because what does the Bible say about the pre-flood world? It was evil. Their thoughts were evil continuously. It was violent. And yet Noah was able to spend all his time building the ark. I'm certain with a crew. I'm sure he hired people to help him.
Right.
But he also had to have a huge amounts of money, what they would have used for money back in those days. If it was as violent and as evil as they said, why didn't someone just come along and steal it? Well, in the ordinary situations, I'm sure they would have done that.
Sure.
But Noah had to have been protected. And God does protect his people at specific times for specific reasons. In this case, he had to protect Noah to give him time to build the ark, to get it ready, which means for that, particularly that 120 years, Noah had to be left alone. He was a preacher of righteousness. He had to be left alone with all the evil around him. And so that all that had to happen to make it possible, because you couldn't do it without those two things being true. And then he had to, and he had to build it and all. The other thing about it is when he built the ark, and this is one of the things I bring out in the book, In the Shadow of the Ark, he would have built it inside a forest. He would not have built it near the water. Because it would be inconvenient actually to build it near the water.
Right, for the wood's sake, if nothing else, right?
He needed to have lots and lots of wood. And he didn't have to worry about the water because the water is going to come to him in the ark. And the ark would have been weighed massive amounts. Couldn't even begin to imagine how many millions of pounds it would have weighed. It could never have moved on its own. It would be impossible to move it on its own.
An interesting point. A few moments ago when we talked about the ark, you said the box. Tell me more about the box instead of what we see a picture of mentally from.
Well, sometimes we see what looks like a boat.
Right.
It was not a boat. If you want to think of it, when I say box, because the word ark actually means box.
Ah.
We have Noah's ark, which is Noah's box. Then think of the other time the ark is used in the Bible, the ark of the
Covenant, sure.
What was the Ark of the Covenant? It was a box. It was a gold-plated box the Israelites carried around, but it was a box because that's what the word actually means. If you saw the ark, it would look very much like what today we call a barge.
Okay.
Today is a barge.
Okay.
Because a barge is not designed like a boat. It doesn't have a stern and a bow like a boat does.
Right.
It's pushed around by boats, pushed around by usually ferry boat or of boats of some sort to push around to get it in the place where it's supposed to, because it's just meant to carry stuff. It doesn't go on its own. It has no power of its own. It has no steering of its own. That's all done from outside, as did Noah's ark. Because when the box was built, the ark was built, it had no way to steer it, had no power source. When Noah got in that ark and the door was closed, he had nothing to do about what's going to happen. For as long as he was in there, he was completely at the mercy of the outside. But what does it say about what happened? It says God remembered Noah. He was going to wipe out the world and start over, but in order to do that, he had to make sure Noah and his family all came through safely. So through all the storms, all the mess of the flood, which would have been massive, he made sure that ark was in a safe place. I'm sure it was rocked around. I'm sure it got miserable inside. I hope none of them had seasickness. It had been rocking around all over the place. And it would have gotten very hot, very humid, because the flood would have been hot and humid. That we know that from some of the things that came out of it. And it would have been unpleasant for months and months and months until it finally landed in the mountains of Ararat. And they were able to sit there for more months inside there. But at least it was still. They weren't seasick anymore. And it would have become more pleasant in terms of the weather. And we also know that around the top of the ark, there were windows for ventilation in order for them to be able to breathe, the animals to live. All the thousands of animals, they came into the ark. Now, keep in mind, Noah didn't bring the animals into the ark. God sent the animals to Noah, and they just went into the ark and then did what Noah told them to do. Basically, they followed directions.
So did Noah and his family take care of the animals? Did they feed them? Did they water them on the ark?
Well, that's an interesting question. It's one we can't be absolutely certain exactly what happened. There's two possibilities. One is that Noah and his family did take care of the animals in the ark, And it wouldn't be all that difficult because, first of all, it would be dark, and they would be in places where they could sleep a lot. And a lot of animals, if they're given the chance, will sleep 20 hours a day.
Okay, true.
And so they didn't have any physical activity, so they wouldn't have to have a lot of food. But so they may have been something of that nature. The other possibility is that God, when they got in the ark, God simply put them to sleep. They simply hibernated. They all just went to sleep.
Interesting. I've never thought about that.
They were in the ark. We don't know what actually happened. They all got their individual little places to stay, little cages, little places. And whether they were fed or whether they went to sleep, we don't really know. But we know even if they were being fed, they wouldn't have to be fed more than once a day. There were approximately, and this is an approximate because we don't know, 10,000 animals in the ark, about 5,000 kinds.
Okay, wow.
As the Bible says.
Right.
But many of those were creatures that you could feed them once a week.
Okay.
They'll stuff themselves for a week and then just live off of that. Because a lot of things like reptiles and other creatures, they can go months without eating, because their metabolism is so slow.
Right.
So there's a lot of creatures like that. And even, again, think of creatures that are mammals, like a bear. Bear can go 6 months without eating. I mean, you and I would have a problem with that.
Right.
We lose a lot of weight. But bears, and they do lose a lot of weight, by the way. When they hibernate, they lose a lot of weight
Okay.
while they're in there 6 months because their body's still going. But they could have gone, maybe only been fed once a week or once a month. That's all the bears need to be fed, and some of the others as well, because they put them fat and they can just stay for a while. Or, as they say, possibly they were asleep. We don't know which is the answer. But either way, it wouldn't have been a big problem for Noah and his family. And they would have had plenty of room. All the animals that we got on the ark could have been on one floor of the ark. There are 3 floors in the ark, and they could have all been on a single floor. Because even though there were probably about 10,000 plus animals, actually individual creatures, 5,000 kinds, the average for an animal in this world, the average I'm talking about, is about the size of a sheep,
Okay.
full-grown sheep. That's not that huge. Now we're talking about some animals like elephants, which are big, but some animals like mice, which are small. And they all would have been on the ark. The elephants and the mice would have been on the same ark. Maybe not in the same cage, but the story about elephants and mice. So, but they would have been on the same ark when it happened. So overall, that's not that big. Sheep is not that big. And he would have had 2 of most, 7 of some, and all the rest. But it would not have been a problem for that, because God would have prepared Noah to know exactly what he was going to build, how many were coming. God would have made sure he had the plans, gave whatever plans he gave. How detailed he went, I don't know. But he would have been detailed enough to make sure that there would have been at least 5,000 little places for it, little cages, little corrals, whatever. Even in some cases, little pools, because some of the animals would have had to have water. Because although we often think of the animals being land animals, turtles and alligators are land animals, but they need their water. So they would have had little pools to keep them in during that time. And so he would have prepared for that sort of thing happening. Unless, of course, as I say, if they slept through the whole thing, if God miraculously made them just go sleep for the year, then maybe not much happened.
Sean, you're so knowledgeable about so many things, and of course, especially the Genesis story. When we're talking about parallel stories from around the world, is there a China story? Chinese history is so fascinating to me because it's so ancient and they've documented it so well. What did the Chinese believe?
I don't specifically know what the Chinese story is. I do remember the Australian story is 2 Australians on a raft with kangaroos and wallabies. With the Eskimo Inuits, they were on a big, basically a rowboat type thing, big boat, with polar bears and other creatures. So each one, what they do is they tend to personalize it to their own culture.
Okay.
But they all tell the same story. I don't remember specifically what the Chinese. I know the Chinese do have at least one. They probably have several, because although we often think of China as being a single country,
right,
which today it is, but for most of its history, it was not.
Okay.
It was actually many different countries and many different cultures, and so they probably had several different stories.
So then again, there were eyewitnesses or interviewers of these eyewitnesses.
The end of the pre-flood story is where Noah signs his name on it. And then the next several chapters, at the end of that, Ham, Shem, and Japheth sign their name to it. And that's also why some people say there are 2 creation stories. They're not 2 creation stories. There's one creation story told by 2 different eyewitnesses. One of the eyewitnesses was God himself. the 7-day story, 7-day creation, all that.
Sure.
Only God could have seen that,
Right.
and God would have had to dictate that to Adam. But at the end of Adam's story, which is chapters 2, 3, and 4, that's where Adam signs it, and he would have written what he saw, because he only wrote from the 6th day, because that's all he saw. He
Of
wasn't
course.
there for the other days. Only
Sure.
God was. But then the next stories, next several chapters, it ends with Noah signing his name to it. But then the flood story itself, when it talks about the rain falling and the raven being put out, and the dove and all the rest being put out, that's where Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Now, some people say there's 2 flood stories. There's simply 2 stories told by 2 different people, the same event.
So perspective.
The perspective changes.
Right.
I mean, I think about this. If you told about your life with your husband, and he told about his life with you, you'd be telling the same story, wouldn't you?
Correct.
But would it be told the same way?
No.
No, exactly.
The
No, you would
variances
not.
for sure.
Because there are 2 different witnesses,
Right.
and each one would emphasize something that was more important to you. You'd say this, you'd have some story that would be very important to you. He might just pass by quickly, and the same thing. Something might be really important to him, but you just glance over quickly.
Right.
And so we see that in the flood story. We see 2 different accounts because they're told by 2 different authors, not about 2 different events. And we go on like that. Everything after that, if you follow carefully through Genesis, about the 10 different books in Genesis, each one signed by the author, whoever of the people who saw it and lived it, and all the rest. And that's why there's some break in Genesis. There are some areas where there's gaps of hundreds of years between the stories. We don't know what happened.
Right.
Because the authors either didn't write it down, or when Moses got all these records, because Moses, what's called edited and redacted it, he just left it up because he didn't think it was important enough. So when Moses wrote what he thought was important, or what God wanted him to write down, which the highlights, but there were lots of lowlights. Think about your life. If you wrote a story about your life, would you write every day how you get up and have breakfast and exactly how you do breakfast?
Right,
all
of
the rest,
course.
go into great detail about every breakfast you ever had in your entire life? No, you pass over that quickly and get into highlights. The birth of your son, the marriage to your husband. Those are the highlights.
Right.
You're not going to spend a lot of time worrying about breakfast.
Sure.
And so that's what Moses did when he did it. Now, we talk about the book. The book is meant to fill in, specifically in the pre-flood world, about what happened. Now, there are 2 main people in it, other than Noah and his family, and that was Kenan, who was the main protagonist, who was from the very beginning of the story, when he was able to capture a dragon, dinosaur, and train it. And then a little later, a woman comes into it, Orani, who eventually ends up being Kenan's wife, though they have a little problems on the way there. And then it goes to the very end, and the story ends with Kenan. And it ends as a story of love and hope, because the whole Bible is a story of love and hope. Some stories in the Bible can be pretty harsh,
Right.
but ultimately, it always ends in love and hope. Because that's God's message to us in everything.
Right. I think that's a great way to put it.
And so Kenan and Orani loved each other. They had hope for each other. They saw good things in each other. They did not get in the ark. I'm not going to go into what happened, so they couldn't get in the ark. But again, since this is biblical historical fiction, I was not going to miswrite
Right.
what happened.
Sure.
The Bible makes it clear only 8 people got in the ark. And Kenan and Orani were not 2 of them. Only Noah's wife, his sons, and his daughters-in-law got in the ark when the time came. And so that was it. But we do talk, again, there's a lot about Kenan and Orani in order to give the idea of what the world was like, how absolutely evil it was.
And that was going to bring, it's good, because that leads into my next question I had thought up, which was, what does Genesis tell us about the world today?
It tells us when the world gets as bad as it was before the flood, then it's time for the second coming. And that's what Jesus said about this too. Chapter 24, Matthew chapter 24, verses 38, 39, he says, in the days of old, when they're eating and drinking and getting married and giving marriage, then Noah entered the ark, and the end came and they were swept away. The flood came and they were all buried basically under the water. And he says that's how it will be in the end times when the second coming, when the Son of Man comes in the second coming. And I truly believe is why God had me write this book now, because he wants people to know today it's as bad as it was back then, it's going to get worse. But think how much evil there is in the world today, and evil not just because there's a war in Ukraine and terrible things happening here and there. Think about it, in a country where children are being mutilated because of an ideology that someone just made up out of their head about you can somehow change your gender. And you get to mutilate people to do it. And how bad is that? You know, we look back on some of the cultures that had human sacrifice.
Right.
And there's one particular one, if you're knowing about ancient history, called the cult of Moloch. And the cult of Moloch, they believed that people would give their babies to be thrown into the fire as an offering to the god Moloch.
Wow.
Think about it. Would you want your baby thrown into a fire to be burned alive?
Cannot imagine.
As an offering to Moloch? And yet there are people today who are taking their children in to be basically human sacrifices to the ideas of today of you can somehow change your gender by just slicing things off and on. Slice this off and put another one on. How bad is that to have no child sacrifice? Because that's what it is, mutilation to fit an ideology. But that's what happens when people turn away from God. I mean, there are only really two ways you can live in this world. There's only two ways. You can live with God, or you can live away from God. And if you live away from God, then you're living anti-God. And we can see that around us all over. We see the pro-God, we see the anti-God. I'm not going to say anything about political parties in this, because that's not what it's about.
Right.
It's about the pro-God people and the anti-God people. And the anti-God people are the ones who do the human sacrifices of children. The pro-God people are the ones who want to save the children, do the best they can to do that. And that's not about politics, that's about morality, and it's about the spiritual enlightenment that God has given people, or how much they don't want to have it.
Well, you'd think we'd come such a far way from the flood, and referencing the book again, your characters which experienced such a brutal, horrific existence, and yet here we are again. So history.
And people today are experience some of the same brutality, some horror. And the question always comes, this is the only legitimate question I think you can ever ask God is this: is it all worth it? And God already answered that question, and the answer is yes. Because what it says in the Bible is that God prepared a sacrifice for our redemption from before the foundation of the world. So when God made this world, did he know it was going to sin? Yes. But did he know the ultimate was going to be worth it? Yes. So that's what if you want to argue, don't argue with me, you got to argue with God. Because he's already come to the conclusion, the idea, yes, it is worth it. What he is making, and what he's going to end up eventually making, is so good that it'll be worth all the suffering to get there. And the ultimate is, what he's making with everything he's done is for one thing, to make the bride of Christ. To give his son, his perfect son, absolute obedient perfect son, one we call Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, a bride, which will be all the believers collectively together to be his bride. Exactly what that means, I don't understand. I'm not going to pretend to do it. There's a lot of things about the Bible I don't get at all. But I do know this. I know who the Creator is. I know who the Redeemer is. And I don't know all the details, but I know those two things.
And that made you want to write this book.
And that's what made me want to write this book, because the Redeemer, the Creator, the one who wants us to repent, those who haven't already repented, wants us to, because he cares about us. Yes, we live in a world that's full of bad things. But one thing about God, and this is always important to remember, God never drafts us. Everyone in God's group are volunteers. You have to volunteer. He does not draft anybody. Even when sometimes he gets a little more physical in some of his getting, and he's done that on occasion. He's gotten pretty direct with some people. He did it with Jonah. He did it with Paul. But he never forced them. He never forced them to do what happened. He did do some very direct action to get their attention, but they're all volunteers in the end, and all of us are volunteers. We're in another podcast, we're going to be talking about what he did or allowed to happen to me, how I volunteered. But I did. As bad as things were before I volunteered, I still did volunteer. And so sometimes God lets bad things happen to his people, either to get them to volunteer to be his people, or to get them to really trust him more. But he allows it. One thing he never did, he never promised us a rose garden. He never did. In this world, there's going to be trouble for his people. Sometimes there's going to be worse trouble for his people than for the rest. But in the end, He promises something. He promises everlasting life. He promises everlasting happiness and everlasting fulfillment. And that's what he eventually ends up promising to both Kenan and Orani. And that's why the book is always, and it must be, a book of hope, love and hope, which is what the Bible is, ultimately a complete love of hope.
That's true. And Sean, I think you've just said something and touched on something that we should explore actually in our next podcast. Let's learn more about you. But for today, we thank you for your time. We'd like to remind our listeners they can go to your website, shadowoftheark.com. People can purchase In the Shadow of the Ark, which is now for sale. And please like our podcast, In the Shadow of the Ark, available wherever good podcasts are distributed, such as iHeart and Apple.